Welcome to this series exploring innovation, progress, and achievement using a technocentric paradigm by Ash Stuart.
You may want to also read Ash's original Substack article for the best experience, including footnotes and other details.
Episode 33b, The Golden Crescendo, the Baton of Knowledge, a most extraordinary story of the transfer of knowledge and innovation. In the previous episode, I said we were going to explore the bigger story underlying a unique case of transcultural synthesis of knowledge and the resulting innovation. That story is not over, so we have this episode as a follow-up. I trust in that episode I've demonstrated the sheer scale of the achievements of scholars of what's been called the Islamic Golden Age. It's worth reading that one if you haven't already. But in summary, over roughly a 500-year period from the year 750 of our era, there arose an extraordinary flourishing of learning in the Islamic world, which at that point in time was only about a century in the making, but having rapidly extended from the borders of India to almost all of the Iberian Peninsula in Western Europe. We saw that a key impetus to this was the commissioning by the early Abbasid rulers at around the beginning of that year, and closely following the founding of Baghdad as their capital, overseeing such a vast empire, of a whole series of translations of ancient Indian, Greek, and Persian scientific and other works into Arabic. This has been called the translation movement. I will reiterate the point I made there that this was not some kind of a passive translation, but a very intense and deliberate effort to build on the entire body of knowledge keenly acquired from such external sources. It was, as I've outlined, an extraordinary synthesis, with the Islamic scholars going way ahead with some genuine, homegrown intellectual progress on top. I also pondered toward the end that we in the modern day, and in particular in the West, are not sufficiently aware of this synthesis and the innovations of the Muslim scholars of the Islamic Golden Age. But was it all lost? That's the question that I now seek to address. Let there be no light! Let's take a step back to get some more context that'll be relevant to us here. In episode 30, I discussed the question of the fall of the Roman Empire. In the Latin West, the end is seen as in the year 476, when a Gothic ruler deposed Romulus Augustulus, seen as the last Roman emperor there. And oh boy, what an irony, to have within the name of such a Roman emperor not just a reference to the first Roman emperor, Augustus, but the very name of the legendary founder of Rome. I often wonder if historians chose this guy and the event as the official fall of Rome just for laughs. But with the Latin West disintegrating politically, it was not just the marble columns. Augustus again. I found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble. It was not just the marble columns that fell into ruin, but a great many other aspects, including a steep decline in writing and the copying of ancient works. Pretty much all of the ancient Greek stuff was forgotten. But we also saw that in the East, the sense of Roman identity survived in the Byzantine Empire, centered in Constantinople, and along with it, a continuation of writing, literary activity, and other similar aspects we call civilization. This was the situation in Europe, East and West, in the 7th century, and in particular by around 750, when the above movement kicked off in and around Baghdad, which we saw in detail in the previous one. The twisted turns of Kismet. I mused in episode 29 while discussing the development of common law from centuries-old Anglo-Saxon customs among ordinary people. The irony around how the advent of generally seen to be brutal and definitely foreign Norman French kings from the continent into England played a key part in preserving such Anglo-Saxon customs, which might not have been the case to the same extent had Anglo-Saxon rule not ended. The fall of Spain. In fact, much of the whole of the Iberian Peninsula, to the Muslim, shall we say, conquistadores, with the advent of Islam, was seen in Christendom as a major amputation, a massive humiliation. And perhaps some Europeans still harbor such a sentiment, although they might have to question their consumption of varieties of carrots, spinach, bananas, oranges, aubergine, and even olives, all introduced, or in the last case, reintroduced by the Arabs into Spain. For in about 8 centuries, initially almost all, and even later significant portions of the peninsula was under Arab or Moorish, mixed Arab-Berber rule. Gradually, of course, the Christian rulers reconquered all of this land, culminating in the taking of Granada in 1492. But the more interesting date from our perspective here is 1085. By the way, the Arabs called this realm Al-Andalus, a word that has been traced back to the Vandals, who, with the Visigoths, ruled much that area prior, and one which lives on in Andalusia. The Queen of Spain's beard. It was in this year, 1085, that the Christian king Alfonso VI of Leon, accompanied by that famous character known in lore as El Cid, took control of Toledo. Toledo, just south of a small town called Almadrid, was a major center of learning and seat of power in Muslim Spain. And this change of management is seen as the first major breakthrough in the Christian reconquest. Strangely, and perhaps unusually, this was a peaceful takeover, and you might say, surprisingly, a tolerant one. Alfonso declared himself the king of 2 religions. The mosque and corresponding practices in the city continued, and the city remained just as bilingual as before, with both Arabic and Romance, not yet Spanish, in use. Likewise, the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants were allowed to remain and hold on to their belongings. Just as we saw last time the emergence of Baghdad as a premier center of learning, of a vast library and critical mass of scholars, Toledo had also risen to and flourished in a comparable position of eminence. It was in such a happenstance that soon began to pour in a number of scholars in pursuit, some with royal patronage, some for the sheer joy of it, of the great riches of the Arabic works in those exalted libraries of Toledo. Arab works of not just Arab creation, but also translation of some of the most important works of ancient Indian and Greek provenance. These European scholars got to work translating these from Arabic, a language they had just freshly acquired, into medieval Latin. Thus was born another translation movement, this time from Arabic to Latin. Possibly the most notable figure here is Gerard of Cremona, translating more than 87 books, including the flagship works of Euclid Elements, Ptolemy Almagest, Aristotle Nicomachean Ethics, Physics, and so on, and indeed Al-Khwarizmi's founding work on algebra. And then there is the Scotsman Michael Scott, a polyglot who moved on from Oxford and Paris to settle in Toledo, pick up Arabic, and get to work. A man of many feathers, having been tutor to a future pope and doted on big time by his later compatriot Walter Scott, Michael Scott was not just a legendary polyglot, but also left his mark in legend, appearing in Dante's Divine Comedy. These are, of course, just a couple of names in a much longer list, a dignified roll call of Jews, Muslims, and Christians. Compare this spirit of inquisitiveness in Spain to the later Spanish Inquisition. And no queenly beards were harmed in the making of this episode. If that reference had you baffled, you can look up this footnote here. Saving the Baton! To appreciate the significance of all this, we have to consider the following. But for the work and works of the Muslim scholars of the Islamic Golden Age, 1. The West might have lost some of the greatest works of classical antiquity, now seen as foundational to what the West is forever. 2. Premier works of science and philosophy, such as those of the ancient Indians, numerals, plastic surgery, and indeed those of the Arabs themselves, as outlined last time, might have never made it to Europe. 3. The European sentiment and renewed interest that eventually led to the Renaissance might never have come to fruition. Okay, I agree. Counterfactuals can never be asserted with conviction, for we can never test them out. We can't unpick one strand in the great fabric of history and trace a neat alternative path of development, rather than it only unraveling our own premise. We can't laboratory simulate alternate contingencies in history. But there is value in our study of innovation and progress in still peeking down the deep and dingy barrel of counterfactual. Shout out to Walter Scheidel, see episode 30. And as I've hinted, for those people curious to understand how what we call the West came to be, there are important lessons here. I'll examine the above in more detail, but first the jarring question of the Dark Ages in West Europe. What the hell happened? With political decentralization, you might say there was a general dissipation of writing, literary activity, and knowledge. But as hinted in the episode on the many falls of Rome, and a point I'll come back to later, decentralization might actually be a good thing. There is one development, however, that's easier to observe. The Roman Catholic Church, which filled some of the political power vacuum and had a monopoly on education, was not particularly interested in the secular works of the past. This varied across time and based on which pope was in charge and so on. But time and again, secular knowledge, such as the works of Aristotle, could be actively demonized. And, importantly, this was in significant contrast to the general attitude of the Islamic scholars, in particular under, say, Abbasid patronage, who embraced secular Greek and other texts, something we'd probably struggle to believe. So yes, in Europe, the lights really went out. Counting the counterfactual costs. Now let's take a closer look then at those three posits of mine. Here's a small set of specific classical works recovered: Euclidean geometry in full form, Ptolemy's Almagest, and other geographical works, Galen's complete medical works, Platonic dialogues preserved through Arabic chains, the body of writing of Aristotle. Even just the name Almagest is from the Arabic rendering of Ptolemy's megalosyntaxis. I'll reiterate a frustration I shared last time: the sheer paucity of accessible material on many of these topics, and especially in English. Anecdotally, in my research, less than a fifth of what's available in Spanish, French, or German. So would we definitely lost such works for good? It's hard for me to say. Alongside the fact that there's still some research and much debate about such a question, and some of this was sourced later from Byzantium, but only after what had been demonstrated to Latin Europe by the Arabs as lost. This requires much more research, and I hope to come back to this with better answers one day, because the question of the loss of previously developed and acquired knowledge and innovation is a particularly burning one. That the works of the Islamic scholars wouldn't have made it to Europe if the Islamic Golden Age hadn't happened should be fairly obvious. About other forms of knowledge from other original Eastern sources, who knows how much longer and more circuitous a path it would have taken, either for the transmission or independent development. Until then, as we saw in episode 28, would you want to go back to multiplying and dividing using Roman numerals? Finally, my claim that but for this the European Renaissance might never happened is indeed a very bold one. As laid out in episode 8, The Plan, I have an entire phase where we'll have the chance to explore this question. Phase 2 of this series, starting from episode 41. But still, let's think about it. How much poorer would Europe and the wider world have been without this extraordinary episode of transcultural transmission and the Islamic Golden Age's synthesis of knowledge and innovation?